The silence of the United Nations Hall was broken not by applause, not by ceremony, but by a voice that carried the weight of centuries. On September 17, 2025, a young African leader stepped forward and placed before the world a figure so staggering, so uncompromising, that even seasoned diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. $847 billion. This was not a request. It was not aid. It was a demand for reparations, the calculated cost of 6 decades of colonial exploitation by France against the people of Burkina Faso. For nearly 80 years, the United Nations has stood as the symbolic center of global cooperation. But on that day, Ibrahim Traoré shattered the illusion. His words were not those of a supplicant asking for a seat at the table. They were the thunder of a generation declaring, "Enough. We will no longer bow." He accused the very institution hosting him of legitimizing the theft of Africa's resources, of shielding colonial powers, and of silencing the majority world. And then came the ultimatum that left Western delegates pale and silent. If reparations were denied, Africa would withdraw from the UN system altogether. Imagine the weight of that moment. 32 African nations standing ready to walk out while delegations from China, Russia, India, and Brazil rose in ovation that lasted 12 minutes. The chamber itself became the stage of history where old power structures trembled and new ones began to take form. The question is now unavoidable. Is this the beginning of Africa reclaiming its stolen future, or the spark of a global confrontation that will shake the very foundation of the post-World War II order? If you believe that the truth matters more than headlines, if you believe that history is being rewritten before our eyes, then join us here. Subscribe, share, and stand with the voices that refuse to be silenced. The afternoon of September 17, 2025 will be remembered not as another routine United Nations session, but as the day when a landlocked country in West Africa forced the entire world to listen. At precisely 2:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim president of Burkina Faso, walked to the podium of the UN General Assembly. There were no flowery pleasantries, no diplomatic small talk. His first words cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Distinguished delegates, I stand before you not as a supplicant seeking Western approval, but as the voice of 28 million Burkinabe and 1.4 billion Africans who refuse to be silent while our resources are plundered." From that moment, the chamber grew tense. Some diplomats adjusted their headphones. Others leaned forward. Everyone understood this would not be a typical speech. Traoré laid out what he called the colonial accounting. With calm but fiery precision, he presented figures compiled by African economists and international legal scholars. Since 1960, he explained France had drained $847 billion from Burkina Faso through 3 channels: the CFA franc currency system, natural resource extraction, and lopsided trade agreements. Through the CFA franc system alone, Burkina Faso was forced to deposit 50% of its foreign reserves in the French treasury. This amounted to $312 billion over 6 decades. Money that could have built schools, hospitals, and factories in Ouagadougou instead financed French infrastructure. Gold extraction from 1960 to 2025, Burkina Faso exported gold worth $285 billion. Yet the state retained only $12 billion. Uranium valued at $89 billion, yet Burkina Faso received less than $4 billion in return. Cotton exports $74 billion, most of it shipped raw to French factories, only to be sold back at inflated prices. Manganese and other minerals, another $87 billion with negligible benefits at home. The math was undeniable. Every Burkinabe child born in those years carried on average a $30,000 loss, not in loans, but in stolen wealth. Then came the ultimatum delivered with a clarity that froze the air. If this assembly refuses to act, if it denies the right to reparations, it proves that the United Nations is not an instrument of justice, but a shield for colonial powers. In that case, Africa will have no choice but to withdraw from institutions that legitimize our exploitation. For a moment, silence gripped the hall. Then something extraordinary happened. 32 African delegations stood as one, clapping, chanting, embracing. The ovation lasted 12 minutes, a rare defiance in that chamber where applause is usually polite and brief. But this was not polite. It was thunder. Delegations from China, Russia, India, and Brazil rose in solidarity, joining the applause. On the opposite side, Western diplomats sat motionless, lips tight, faces pale. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres shifted uneasily on his chair, caught between worlds, an institution founded by the victors of 1945, now confronted by the demands of those it had long marginalized. This was more than a speech. It was an indictment. For the first time in the UN's history, a head of state publicly threatened to dismantle the system from within. And unlike previous rhetorical flourishes, Traoré brought evidence legal precedents from the International Court of Justice, the 1960 UN Declaration on Decolonization, and the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. The message was unmistakable. Reparations were not a dream. They were a legal right, a calculated debt, and the choice was stark: $847 billion, or the collapse of Africa's participation in the United Nations. For ordinary Africans watching across the continent, it was a moment of vindication. For the West, it was the sound of an old order beginning to crack. The chamber had heard many fiery speeches before, accusations of hypocrisy, calls for reform, but what Ibrahim Traoré delivered was not mere rhetoric. It was an ultimatum, and its impact was immediate. As the final words of his reparations demand echoed through the United Nations General Assembly, the air seemed to crack with tension. Then the eruption came. 32 African delegations rose to their feet, applauding, chanting, and signaling their support. Some diplomats embraced, others lifted clenched fists, and a roar of approval filled the chamber. This was not symbolic applause. It was a declaration that Africa, long divided and often hesitant, was ready to stand as one. The applause lasted 12 minutes, an eternity in diplomatic time. Cameras captured Western delegates frozen in their seats. The representatives of France, the United States, and the United Kingdom remained stiff, their hands motionless, their eyes narrowed. Antonio Guterres, the Secretary-General, could be seen whispering urgently to aides, his unease plain for all to see. Then, one after another, the endorsements rolled in from powers outside the West. China's ambassador Zhang Jun took the microphone. Captain Traoré speaks truth about an international system that serves the few at the expense of the many. China supports more democratic and representative global governance. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov added, "The United Nations reflects the power balance of 1945, not the reality of 2025. Russia welcomes a discussion on more equitable institutions." India's External Affairs Minister declared, "For decades we have called for reform. If reform is denied, then alternatives must be built." The Global South Assembly deserves serious consideration. Brazil's delegation nodded firmly, reminding the hall that Latin America, too, had endured centuries of extraction under colonial powers. For a brief moment, the General Assembly looked less like a debating chamber and more like a battlefield of history: Global South on one side, Western powers on the other, and the West. Their response revealed panic beneath the polished language. The United States Secretary of State warned against divisive rhetoric that threatens cooperation. France's foreign minister dismissed Traoré's claims as baseless accusations, insisting France had provided partnership and development. The United Kingdom called the reparations demand historically inaccurate and economically impossible. Germany tried to diffuse tensions, urging that reform must come through existing mechanisms, not through parallel institutions. But none of these words could erase the optics of the moment. The West looked defensive, shaken, and isolated. Meanwhile, in capitals across Africa, the reaction was electric. In Accra, Ghana's parliament broke into spontaneous applause as the speech was broadcast live. In Nairobi, young activists poured into the streets waving flags and chanting Traoré's name. In Lagos, Nigerian commentators demanded their government join Burkina Faso in calculating the cost of colonial extraction. Social media across the continent lit up with a single phrase: $647 billion. The symbolism was powerful. For the first time in living memory, a leader from a small African nation had forced the world to listen, not with weapons, but with evidence, law, and moral authority. And more than that, he had outlined an alternative: the creation of a Global South Assembly, a new institution free from Western vetoes, free from financial blackmail, and built on the principle of equality among nations. That proposal alone was revolutionary. It was not just a critique of the UN, it was a blueprint to replace it. Traoré even announced a founding conference in Ouagadougou, December 15, 2025, inviting nations to commit by November 1st. Suddenly, the prospect of a world split between two systems, one Western-led, one Southern-led, felt real, tangible, imminent. This was the climax of the confrontation. The old order had been named, shamed, and challenged. The new order had been sketched in bold strokes. And the Hall of the United Nations, once the citadel of post-war consensus, had become the stage where that consensus began to crumble. The applause that afternoon was not simply for Ibrahim Traoré. It was for the possibility that history long written by the victors of empire might finally be rewritten by its survivors. What followed Ibrahim Traoré's explosive demand was not just diplomatic noise, it was a tremor that shook both the streets of Africa and the boardrooms of the West. Because once a number is named, once $847 billion is placed on the table, it cannot be forgotten. It becomes a rallying cry, a benchmark, a weapon. Across Burkina Faso, the immediate effect was one of unity and pride. In Ouagadougou's markets, vendors replayed clips of the speech on their phones. Taxi drivers leaned out of windows shouting, 847 billion. Justice teachers told students this was the day their nation's dignity was restored. Even those who had criticized Traoré for suspending elections now whispered that perhaps his fight was larger than politics. It was about reclaiming the nation's stolen future. But the consequences went beyond national pride. Experts across Africa began running their own numbers. Economists in Ghana, Nigeria, and Senegal openly discussed what reparations their nations could demand. Some estimates suggested trillions in potential claims if the precedent took hold. Suddenly, colonialism was no longer a chapter of history books. It was a financial debt, calculable, demandable, and payable. This prospect terrified Western capitals. France faced the most immediate threat. 14 other CFA franc countries could now unite with Burkina Faso, demanding restitution for decades of forced deposits and undervalued trade. The European press warned of a reparations avalanche that could bankrupt French institutions and destabilize the European Union. Western governments responded with the oldest tools of power divide and pressure. French diplomats met African leaders privately, offering aid packages and trade deals in exchange for silence. The International Monetary Fund quietly hinted at loan suspensions. Western banks restricted credit to African states seen as sympathetic to Traoré's initiative. The message was clear: join the reparations push and you will pay a price. Yet on the streets of Africa, these threats only deepened anger. In Lagos, activists marched with signs reading, "Our debt is stolen wealth." In Nairobi, lawyers volunteered to help document historical losses. In Bamako, veterans of Mali's independence struggle declared that the time for justice had finally come. The civil awakening was unmistakable. Ordinary citizens now saw themselves not as passive victims of history, but as creditors of a global system that owed them. Politically, Traoré's speech also redrew the map of leadership in Africa. For years, major powers like South Africa and Nigeria were seen as continental voices. Now, a young captain from Burkina Faso had seized the mantle of revolutionary legitimacy. His insistence on reparations gave smaller nations hope that size did not determine influence, courage did. Of course, the risks were enormous. Western propaganda machines quickly portrayed Traoré as reckless, even dangerous. Headlines in Paris and London warned of economic chaos if Africa pursued reparations. American commentators accused him of fueling anti-Western populism. These narratives were designed to isolate him, to frighten others into retreat. But history rarely moves without risk. By daring to name the debt, Traoré forced a confrontation that can no longer be postponed. For Burkina Faso, the immediate consequence was unity at home and heightened pressure abroad. For Africa, it was the beginning of a continental debate. Do we demand what was stolen, or do we remain trapped in structures designed to keep us silent? And for the world, the meaning was unmistakable. A reckoning long deferred had finally arrived, and the survivors of empire were no longer asking. They were demanding. For the United States, Ibrahim Traoré's speech was more than a diplomatic challenge. It struck at the very architecture of the global order that Washington has safeguarded since 1945. The United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank, pillars of the rules-based order, were suddenly exposed as vulnerable, even replaceable. For American policymakers, this was not only about Burkina Faso. It was about the possibility that much of the global South, representing two-thirds of humanity, might walk away from the system that underpins U.S. influence. In Washington, analysts immediately worried about precedent. If reparations could be quantified and demanded from France, what would stop former colonies in Asia, the Caribbean, or even indigenous nations in North America from making similar claims? A tribunal recognizing Burkina Faso's claim could open the floodgates, unleashing trillions of dollars in liabilities. For a country already grappling with debt and domestic polarization, the specter of reparations on a global scale was deeply unsettling. The broader Western alliance reacted with a mixture of denial and fear. France, at the center of the storm, dismissed the figures as exaggerated and historically inaccurate. But even French newspapers admitted the danger Traoré's speech had given voice to grievances long whispered but never articulated so clearly in international law. The United Kingdom echoed France's warning that reparations were economically impossible. Germany tried a softer line suggesting incremental reform of the UN rather than a rival institution. Yet, the common thread in all Western responses was defensiveness. None could erase the fact that the applause in New York came not for them, but against them. Meanwhile, in the wider world, Traoré's message resonated. China, already locked in strategic competition with the US, seized the opportunity to support a more democratic international order. Russia, under Western sanctions, welcomed a challenge to institutions dominated by Washington and Brussels. India and Brazil, representing vast populations, recognized the speech as leverage to push their long-standing demand for Security Council reform. What Traoré had sparked was not simply African solidarity, but the alignment of major powers outside the Western Bloc. The symbolism was powerful. A young leader from a small, resource-rich but impoverished nation had voiced aloud what many had felt, that the world remains divided between those who set the rules and those forced to live under them. By threatening to withdraw Africa from the United Nations, Traoré effectively declared that the legitimacy of the old order could no longer be taken for granted. For older Americans watching from afar, the question is sobering. The institutions built by the greatest generation after World War II were meant to ensure peace and stability. But are they now instruments of inequality, preserving the privileges of a few at the expense of the many? When Traoré demands reparations, he is not only challenging France, he is questioning whether the United States can still claim to stand for fairness in global governance. What comes next is uncertain. The December 15th conference in Ouagadougou may be dismissed as symbolic, or it may mark the birth of a Global South Assembly rivaling the UN itself. If that happens, Washington and its allies will face a world they can no longer control through old institutions alone. The balance of power would tilt not by war, but by withdrawal. And in that shift lies a haunting truth. The empire built on post-war institutions is showing cracks. And those cracks are being widened not by generals or armies, but by a young captain with the courage to name the debt and demand it be paid. History often turns not on battlefields, but in quiet halls when one voice dares to challenge the silence. On September 17, 2025, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso delivered such a challenge. In 47 minutes, he named a debt $847 billion and demanded that the world's most powerful nations confront the truth of their colonial past. He did not speak as a beggar, nor as a diplomat offering compromise. He spoke as a man carrying the weight of his people, declaring that justice delayed is justice denied. But let us be clear, this moment is not only about Burkina Faso, it is about the fragile legitimacy of the entire post-war order. If one African nation can demand reparations and back that demand with law, evidence, and solidarity, then every former colony may soon follow. Trillions of dollars could be claimed. Institutions that once seemed untouchable could face collapse. The question is no longer whether Africa will challenge the system, but whether the system can survive that challenge. For Western powers, the temptation will be to dismiss Traoré as radical or reckless. Yet their very panic, the scrambling meetings, the dismissive press releases the threats whispered behind closed doors, betrays their fear. Because deep down they know the claim is not a fantasy. It is fact. The numbers are real. The theft was systematic, and history is catching up. For ordinary Africans, especially the young, this speech has become more than news, it is a signal. A signal that dignity is not given, it is claimed. That sovereignty is not a theory, it is built. And that justice, though delayed for generations, can still be demanded today. And for you watching from across the ocean, the question is sobering. Do you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's demand marks the beginning of true justice or the opening of a dangerous confrontation with the West? Should Africa build its own Global South Assembly, or should it struggle to reform a system that has resisted change for nearly 80 years? Can we continue to trust institutions built in 1945, or is it time for something new, something led not by the victors of war, but by the survivors of empire? Brothers and sisters, the cracks in the old order are widening. The applause in New York was not simply for a man, but for an idea that the global South can rise united and no longer beg permission to exist with dignity. If you feel this moment represents more than politics, if you sense it is history unfolding before our eyes, then let your voice be heard. Please share if you believe Africa's time has come. Comment if you stand with justice for Burkina Faso, and subscribe if you know that truth matters more than headlines. Because on that September day, Ibrahim Traoré proved that one voice can shake the pillars of empire. The question now is whether we the people will let the echo fade or carry it forward into a new world.